Happy Halloween, friends. Welcome to Look What You Learned, a channel that's absolutely sopping with mystery and intrigue. I'm the mask behind the man, but you can call me Jack. October is here, and that means one thing. The veil is thin, and the souls of the dead walk among us. They, along with all sorts of demons and monsters, have begun to cross over from the worlds of the beyond in order to invade our little corner of reality. There's literally a ghost right behind you, right now, probably. It'll only get worse until it culminates on Halloween night, when the barrier's weakest and the grisly ghouls can grab you and drag you back to their own domain. Now I know this is scary, but calm down. You have a few things going for you. Firstly, this is all make-believe and I'm just doing a hilarious bit. Secondly, it's pretty easy to avoid getting got on Halloween. All you gotta do is not look like a normal, fleshy human person, and luckily, there are multiple stores with a wide selection of scary monster costumes available. That begs the question though, would these costumes fool a discerning demon or a smart specter? After all, our ideas about what these classic monsters look like have changed quite a bit since they were first conceived. So, today, we'll take a look at 3 classic Halloween costumes and compare them to their original mythological description, to see if they've remained accurate to the source material or if they've been consumed by modern reimagining. We'll start with the most classic of classics, the vampire. Vampires have been described in a huge variety of ways since ye olden times, and this variety has translated into the kind of costumes you can find today. There are scary vampires and sparkly sexy vampires. Basically, however you think a vampire should look, there's probably a costume for it. However, when you get down to it, the style of vampire costume that you'll come across more often than not is something like this: a clean-shaven European aristocrat with fangs. They'll probably have a fancy shirt and maybe some jewelry. They'll almost certainly have a cape. You know what, let's just stop beating around the bush. They look like Dracula. They look like Bela Lugosi's Count Dracula from the 1930s movie. It's not hard to understand why this is. Bram Stoker's book was hugely influential, though a lot of Dracula's behavior was actually inspired by the character Lord Ruthven from the earlier book, The Vampire, with a Y. Together, these two basically defined a modern vampire as a being that's monstrous, yes, but also one that can be suave and darkly alluring. Then the movie took this idea and introduced it to a wider audience. Part of the reason this depiction has been so influential is that it really leans into the idea of being different, but in a sexy, superior way. This fancy getup might look a bit ridiculous, but it still conveys an air of high society, wealth and status, culture and intellect, all of it in one person. And as an immortal vampire, that person doesn't just look the look. They really do have centuries of experience and wisdom, but are physically untouched by time. Yeah, they might need to feed on the living, but if you fall under their spell, you might end up like them, and maybe you kind of want to. So now that we understand what this kind of costume is all about, we need to see how it compares to the original vampires of folklore. Now, there's a lot of mythological creatures from different parts of the world that have vampire-like qualities, so to simplify it, we're going to focus on the creatures that were actually called vampires. So that would mean we're comparing them to the vampires of 18th century Eastern Europe, and folks, I gotta say, the differences are substantial. Vamps of folklore weren't so much dark and mysterious as they were horrific monsters that were bad and evil and that you definitely didn't want to bang. Vampires have always been known as the living dead, but geez, did the people of old really focus on the dead part of that phrase, as their vampires looked like grotesque corpses in the middle of one of the stages of decomposition. They may be bloated and moist or dry and skeletal, but either way, they were really, really not sexy. The 18th century writer Voltaire describes them as being fat and rosy after feeding. Decaying corpses are not pleasant to look at, so it makes a fitting punishment for a particularly wicked person to be stuck forever as one of these gross husks, no longer alive, but still conscious and animated, unable to rest and plagued by an unending hunger that can only be temporarily satiated by the blood of the living. They also would be wearing whatever they were buried in, so unless they were part of the nobility, it's unlikely that they would get to wear such dapper clothes and instead would have to settle for something like this. But what about the fangs? I mean, it's arguably the most notable feature of a modern vampire, so did that come from folklore? Well, to that I say, maybe? These vampires still bit people in order to get the hemoglobin, but there isn't really anything I could find that describes them as having fangs. It's likely that some variations of the legend featured fangs, but still, it just seems like it wasn't common enough to be featured in a lot of writing. Hell, I don't even think Lord Ruthven had them. They were really specific to Dracula and his victims. Let's move on from the bloodsuckers and focus on a costume that's arguably more iconic to Halloween: the witch. Like most costume themes, there's a lot of variety, but there are a few key elements that instantly evoke and convey the idea of a witch. Namely, a pointy hat, broomstick, and some kind of long garment, such as robes, a dark dress, or most notably, the simple black gown. You throw that on and nobody's gonna have to ask what you are, though honestly, the hat could probably be enough. This is another instance where there's an obvious reason why this look has had such longevity, regardless of its true origins. It's the Wicked Witch of the West. It's almost exactly what one of the most famous movie witches of all time wore. She also has a few other features that are maybe not as common today, but are still iconic, notably her green skin, hooked nose, and wart. She's also a woman, another thing commonly associated with the word witch. I don't think I've told you anything new so far. It's all been pretty common info. So we must return to the question, how historically accurate is a costume like this? This is another case where there's a whole lot of figures from various cultures and time periods that would be considered witches by today's Western standards, including real people who self-identify as such. For the purposes of this video, we'll focus on witches as they were described in medieval Europe, as while this isn't the origin point for witchcraft in general, it is where a lot of modern interpretations of witches as a spooky Halloween monster come from. So how does something like this stack up? In this case, it's actually surprisingly kinda accurate. One of the things that distinguishes witches from other monsters in the minds of medieval folk is that they didn't necessarily look monstrous. They looked like regular people, so anyone who steps out of line could potentially be accused of witchcraft. And by anyone, I mean any woman. Men could be accused as well, but for the vast majority of cases, witches were associated with women. As such, they would wear womanly clothing, like dresses, and use womanly appliances, like brooms, except they wouldn't be using them for normal chores, but rather dark, perverse things like defying gravity. Now, if you're gonna accuse someone of being an evil enchantress, then you need to kinda have some kind of proof. After all, they're not likely to immediately confess to doing magic. Thankfully, which I say with gigantic sarcastic quotations, the real-world witch hunting manual listed several physical features that could be used to identify witches, including blemishes like warts, moles, and birthmarks. But again, we're left wondering about the most iconic part of the costume, this time the pointy hat. There aren't really any medieval sources specifically associating a hat like this with witches, however, that doesn't mean that there isn't a connection. By the 1700s, there were wood carvings depicting witches with their iconic cone hat, though this kinda seems like it was more of an artistic symbol rather than something people actually expected them to wear. But why a pointy hat? Well, the most likely explanation is linked to something genuinely scary: anti-Semitism. See, starting in the 13th century, Jews living in parts of Europe, including England and Germany, were required to wear clothing that distinguished them from Christians. One of these special clothes was a cornutus. I don't know if I said that right. A pointy hat, which served as an easy way to identify Jews, not only in real life, but in art as well. Now, this wasn't done for positive reasons. Jews weren't really looked on fondly, and as such, this pointy hat carried some very negative connotations. Over time, it changed from a purely Jewish signifier to a more universal symbol that someone in a drawing was supposed to be bad. So yeah, people in the Middle Ages might not have specifically expected a witch to be wearing a hat like this, but if they saw one that was, it would still make sense to them. So we've covered one costume that's pretty different from its original version, and one that's kinda close. Let's finish this video with one that's maybe a little less clear-cut. Fittingly, it's the monster that would be scariest to many medieval folk, the King of Hell, the Prince of Evil, the Dark Lord himself, the Devil.
For the devils! The devils!
By far the most common devil costume today is something like this: a red outfit and a cape with a pitchfork and horns. If there's a mask or face paint, it'll also be red. This has been the predominant version of Lucifer since the early 20th century, and it makes sense. He's red because of how hot hell is, the pitchfork is for poking sinners, he's got horns and a tail because he's a demon. That all makes sense, yes? So is it accurate to the source material? I said before that this one wasn't as cut and dry, and that's because what you consider as the source for Satan's original canon appearance is a little complicated. Now, you might just say, no it's not, he comes from the Bible, just go with that. Which I would, except that there really isn't a clear description of the guy in the Bible. In the book of Revelation, there's a section that describes a beast which rose out of the earth with 2 horns like a lamb, who speaks like a dragon, as well as a great red dragon whose tail swept down 1/3 of the angels in heaven, and both of these are usually interpreted as being about the devil. However, not only is this not specifically stated to be Satan, you also have to keep in mind that the book of Revelation, and really the whole Bible, use a lot of symbolic language, which most biblical scholars agree isn't meant to be a literal description of anything. Okay, bummer, but hey, we know that Lucifer was an angel, and they get described in Ezekiel. I'm not going to read the description, but they supposedly look something like this, or this. Zeke actually describes 2 different types of angelic beings, the cherubs and the thrones, and therein lies the problem. Which, if any, are Lucifer? It's not specified. Another dead end, womp womp. So, there's no original literary description, but what about visual art? After all, that's what shapes most people's image of a character, right? There's a lot of drawings and paintings of Satan, depicting him as anything from a gleeful monster to a sad pretty boy. So let's specifically look at the first, or rather the oldest known, portrait, since that should hold precedent, right? I mean, it came first. The oldest visual description of Satan is in a mosaic from Ravenna, Italy, which dates back to the 6th century. In it, Mr. Dark Lord of Hell and Damnation is just a blue angel-looking guy. It's actually kind of funny how this is the exact opposite of the costume we're comparing it to. So yeah, there really isn't one clear mythologically accurate version of Satan. So then where does this come from? The earliest version of something like this, specifically, that I could find is on the cover of the sheet music for the 1913 song At the Devil's Ballroom. I mean, he doesn't have a pitchfork, but otherwise it's pretty close. Satan's iconic poker seems to have come from his association with the Greek god of the underworld, Hades. The two aren't really that similar. However, to the Roman Empire, the association was a good way of converting pagans to Christianity, so lump them together. But then, what do you wear if you want an accurate costume? Well, since the source material isn't clear, this one's really up to you. Do you prefer horrible demon Satan, or Lucifer, the beautiful tempter? Personally, I'm a fan of the all-white suit Lucifer is seen wearing in Constantine, and a couple times in Supernatural. Do you think Supernatural copied this from Constantine? They based Cass off of the character in the comics, so maybe?
Alright, well that's it for this video. Sorry if it came out a little later than expected. If you can hear from my voice, I got about 90% of the way through this video, and then I got really fucking sick. So, sorry it's coming out near the end of the month, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. Hopefully it helped at least a few poor souls avoid being taken to the underworld, and if so, I think you pretty much owe me a like and subscribe. If this video didn't do it for you, I got plenty of more content coming out, so hit a like and subscribe anyway, cause you never know, you might like something I put out. I'll have more for you next month, but for now, look what you learned. Oh, and happy Halloween.